number. Can you show us up with 925 Adam? Halldale, Rosecrans.
911, what's your emergency?
Hello everyone! Welcome to episode 11 of my series, Crafts and Crimes. Every week I post a new video of myself crafting while talking about a different true crime case. This week I will be talking about the Great Train Robbery of 1963. The Great Train Robbery took place in the early morning hours of August 8th, 1963 in Ledburn on the Bridego Railway Bridge. A gang of 15 men, led by Bruce Reynolds, a known burglar and armed robber, attacked the Royal Mail train after tampering with the line-side signals to force the train to stop. The gang's other known members included Douglas Gordon Goody, Ronald Buster Edwards, Charlie the Silent Man Wilson, Roy James, John Daly, Jimmy White, Ronnie Briggs, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Bob Welsh, and Roger Corddry. There were 3 members of the gang known only as 1, 2, and 3, but 2 of them were later identified as Henry Smith and Danny Pembroke. The final member of the gang was a retired, unnamed train driver. The plan to rob the train was developed with the help of an inside man known only as the Ulsterman, whose real identity has never been established. With the assistance of this inside man, the robbers escaped with over £2.3 million, or $30 million in today's money. The plan to intercept the overnight postal train from Glasgow to London was brought to Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards by the Ulsterman, a senior security officer within the Royal Mail who had knowledge of the amount of money being carried on the train. This security officer was introduced to Goody and Edwards by a London solicitor's clerk named Brian Fielding. The plan to raid the train was developed over several months by Goody, Edwards, Wilson, and Reynolds, with the latter taking the role of mastermind. Although this gang were very experienced criminals, they had very little knowledge about train robberies, and the decision was made to recruit another gang to help. They were called the South Coast Raiders and included Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, Jim Hussey, and Roger Corddry, who knew how to rig the trackside signals to stop the train. Ronnie Briggs, who became possibly the most famous member of the gang, was recruited by Bruce Reynolds after the 2 met in prison, and the final gang consisted of 16 members. On Wednesday, the 7th of August, 1963, the travelling post office up special train set off from Glasgow Central Station en route to London Euston Station and was expected to arrive at 4 a.m. The train was made up of 12 carriages and 72 staff members who sorted the mail throughout the journey. The second 2 carriages behind the engine were known as the high-value package coaches. It was here that money and registered post was kept for sorting. Usually, the value of the shipment would have been around £300,000, but because the previous weekend was a bank holiday, the shipment was between £2.5 and £3 million. Normally, the HVP compartments would have been fitted with security measures such as alarms, bars over the windows, or catches and bolts on the doors, a security measure that had been implemented in 1961. However, all 3 of these carriages fitted with those measures were out of service at the time, and so a reserve carriage was used. The gang were able to stop the train by stuffing a glove into the green signal light and using a 6-volt battery to activate the red signal light. As train driver Jack Mills was approaching Sears Crossing between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington, he wasn't expecting to see a red signal at that time of night, but he brought the locomotive to a stop. The co-driver, David Whitby, climbed out of the train to call the signalman to find out what the problem was. He realized the phone line had been cut, and as he returned to the train, he was attacked and thrown down a steep embankment. One of the gang climbed into the train cab and attacked Jack Mills with a kosh, knocking him unconscious, while other members of the gang began uncoupling the high-value package carriages from the rest of the train. Part of the plan had included a retired train driver recruited by Ronnie Briggs to move the train half a mile to the Bridego Bridge because the steep embankments at Sears Crossing made it too difficult to unload the money from the train. Once he was behind the controls, however, he realized that this new engine was far too complicated for him to operate, and the gang had to rouse Jack Mills and force him to drive the train half a mile to the bridge. Although there were 70 staff members on board the rest of the train, there were no police or security officers, so they were unaware of what was happening at the front of the train. When they arrived at Bridego Bridge, the gang stormed the HVP carriages, and 2 members of staff, Frank Dewhurst and Thomas Kett, made a vain attempt to prevent the robbers from storming the carriage. The 2 men were hit with cautious, and the other staff members were forced to lay face down in the corner of the carriage. Mills and Whitby were handcuffed together and forced down next to the others. The gang formed a human chain to unload the train, and within 15 minutes, they had unloaded 120 sacks containing 2.5 tons of money. One of the robbers instructed the post office staff to remain still for 30 minutes before contacting the police. Since they had thought to cut the phone lines, it was 4:15 in the morning before any alarm reached the signalman. It was around this time the gang arrived back at Leatherslade Farm in Oakley, Buckinghamshire. While here, the gang celebrated by dividing up the money and playing a game of Monopoly with it. Little did they realize, by telling the postal staff to wait 30 minutes before calling the police, they would be giving investigators a massive clue. The investigation was run by the flying squad at Scotland Yard and senior detectives from the Buckinghamshire Police, who were also assisted by the British Transport Police. When listening to the radio, the gang realized they couldn't stay at the farmhouse as planned because the police were searching a 30-mile radius of the robbery site using a dragnet tactic, and with help from the public, they would be caught soon if they stayed. Brian Fields had arranged for an associate, known only as Mark, to clean up the farmhouse and burn it down. However, Mark failed to stick to the agreement and instead left the gang exposed. A nearby resident who was suspicious of all the activity at Leatherslade Farm contacted the police. When PC John Woolley responded to the report, he arrived at the farmhouse to find a large amount of abandoned food, provisions, sleeping bags, money wrappers, post office sacks, and registered mail packages. A thorough examination turned up fingerprints, including those on the Monopoly board. Random side note, that Monopoly board is actually on display at the Thames Valley Police Museum, just in case anyone wants to go see it. The first member of the gang to be caught was Roger Cordry. He was with his friend William Bill Bowl, who was helping him lie low after the robbery. The police were tipped off by the pair's landlady, Ethel Clark, the widow of a former police officer who was suspicious of the men who had paid her 3 months' rent in advance, all in 10-shilling notes. The trial of the robbers began on January 20th, 1964, at the Aylesbury Rural District Council offices, which needed to be specially converted to accommodate the 11 suspects on trial, their lawyers, and the press. Justice Edmund Davies presided over the proceedings, which lasted 51 days. It included 613 pieces of evidence and 240 witnesses. On February 11th, 1964, in a move that shocked everyone, John Daly's lawyer was able to argue that all the evidence against him was circumstantial. Despite his fingerprints being found on the Monopoly board and the fact he went underground after the robbery, his lawyer argued that he played a game of Monopoly with his brother-in-law Bruce Reynolds months before and only went underground because people he was associated with were wanted for questioning in the crime. According to the lawyer, this was not proof of any involvement in a conspiracy. Surprisingly, this worked, and the judge ordered the jury to acquit John Daly. 9 of the men received sentences of 25 to 30 years for the crime. John Weeder, the solicitor Brian Fielding worked for, received 3 years for conspiracy. In 1964, Lenny Field and Brian Field, no relation, were able to have their sentences reduced to 5 years after appealing the charges of conspiracy to commit robbery, and were instead only serving time for obstruction of justice. Bill Bull had his conspiracy to commit robbery charges appealed successfully and was instead only serving time for receiving stolen property. Unfortunately for Bill, he would pass away in prison after a long illness in 1970. Police would later acknowledge that he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, which I'm sure was of little comfort to his family. Roger Corddry, as the oldest member of the gang, was lucky to have his conspiracy conviction overturned. This most likely had to do with the fact that his fingerprints weren't found on the Monopoly board or anywhere at the farmhouse. Several of the gang members were fugitives post-sentencing. Jimmy White was a renowned locksmith and thief who had already been on the run for 10 years and was the only member of the gang not to flee the United Kingdom. He was said to have, quote, a remarkable ability to be invisible, to merge with his surroundings, and become the ultimate Mr. Nobody. While on the run with his wife and son, Jimmy was recognized by a friend who saw his picture in the paper and reported him to the police. He was tried in June 1966 in Leicester Assize and was sentenced to 18 years in prison by Justice Nild. Considerably less time was received than those gang members convicted in 1964. For anyone who doesn't know what an assize is, because I didn't, they were period courts held around England and Wales up until 1972. They exercised both civil and criminal jurisdiction, though most of their work was on the criminal side. They were abolished by the Courts Act 1971 and replaced with permanent Crown courts. On June 6, 1964, Bruce Reynolds fled to Mexico and was joined shortly afterward by his wife and son. They didn't like Mexico and relocated to Canada in December 1966. After spending most of their share of the money, the Reynolds family relocated to Nice in France before returning to England when they ran out of money. Bruce Reynolds was caught in Torquay on November 8, 1968. Buster Edwards also fled to Mexico to meet up with Bruce, but returned to England in September 1966 to voluntarily surrender. On August 12, 1964, Charlie Wilson escaped from Winson Green Prison in Birmingham in under 3 minutes. 3 men broke into the prison to help him escape, and this escape team was never caught. 2 weeks after his escape, Wilson was in France having plastic surgery before later joining Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards in Mexico City. He eventually settled in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, with his wife and 3 daughters, living under the name Richard Alloway. When he invited his brother-in-law to join the family for Christmas, Scotland Yard was able to track him down and recapture Charlie Wilson. They waited 3 months before arresting him in the hopes that he could lead them to Bruce Reynolds, who had yet to be caught at this point. Wilson was arrested on January 25, 1968, and extradited back to the UK. In July 1965, Ronnie Briggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison by climbing a ladder dropped over the 30-foot wall during exercise time. The escape was carried out by Paul Seacombe, who was recently released with the help of ex-convicts Ronnie Leslie and Ronnie Black, with support from Briggs' wife, Charmaine. Ronnie Briggs and his friend Eric Flowers, who also escaped, paid a lot of money to be smuggled into Paris to have plastic surgery. Ronnie then fled to Adelaide in Australia with his wife, where he worked as a builder and had a 3rd son. When Briggs received word that Interpol were aware that he was in Adelaide, he fled to Melbourne, before finally leaving for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Since Britain didn't have an extradition treaty with Brazil, and because he was the father to a son born in the country, this gave him legal immunity and he was able to live openly for years. In May 2001, at 71 years old, after suffering 3 strokes, Briggs returned to England voluntarily after 35 years on the run. He was quoted as saying he wanted to walk into a Margate pub as an Englishman and buy a pint of bitter. Ronnie Briggs was arrested immediately after arriving back in England. After a short court hearing, he was returned to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. On July 2nd, 2009, he was denied parole by Justice Secretary Jack Straw, who described Briggs as being, quote, still wholly unrepentant. He was finally released from prison 2 days before his 80th birthday on compassionate grounds, and Ronnie Briggs passed away on December 18th, 2013 at the age of 84. There were several members of the gang who got away without any prison time. Mr. One, aka Bill Flossie Jennings, was a name provided to the police by Bruce Reynolds, who claimed not to know the man's real name, but it is suspected that this was Henry Smith. Unlike many of the gang, Smith was able to spend his share of the money, purchasing 28 houses, a hotel, and a drinking club in Portsmouth. Danny Pembroke was the most cautious of the gang, and nothing was found at Leatherslade Farm to connect him to the crime. However, out of fear of being betrayed by fellow gang members, he came to an agreement with Detective Inspector Frank Williams and paid back £47,245 of the missing money. Not long after this, Danny left to live in America for a few years before quietly returning to live the rest of his life in Kent. In an August 2019 documentary on Channel 4, his son, also named Danny, admitted that his father was involved in the Great Train Robbery. The final member, who served no time, was the replacement train driver, who was known as Dad or Pops, Peter, and Stan Agate by the other gang members. He was tracked down by author Piers Paul Reed with information provided to him by Ronnie Briggs in a town 20 minutes from London, being cared for by his wife because he had gone a little senile. She admitted to burning his clothes when he arrived home after the robbery and waited for either the gang to come murder him or the police to come, but neither arrived. Piers promised to keep their identities a secret, and to this day, nothing is known of the man other than he was recruited by Ronnie Briggs and that he is believed to have died in 1994. As of 2023, the only member of the gang who is known to still be alive is Robert Welch. The total amount of money stolen was £2,631,684, although the official police record has it listed as £2,595,997, and the majority of it was quickly laundered or divided among friends of the gang. Although within 6 months of the robbery, 10 of the robbers had been locked up awaiting trial and 3 others were wanted criminals on the run, very little of the money has actually been recovered. This has led to speculation that there is a great deal of robbery loot still out there. Less than £400,000 of the stolen money was ever recovered. The crime was well planned and executed, and apart from the attack on Jack Mills, the train driver, it is said that the Great Train Robbery was non-violent and no firearms were used. This is really a very interesting case with so many unanswered questions to this day. There are tons of books, TV shows, and even a film about it. I'll leave some of the titles of these books, TV shows, and the film all pinned in the comments if you want to check them out for yourselves. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Crafts and Crimes. This case has been a nice palate cleanser from my previous serial killer cases. If you're interested in the things I'm crafting, please check out the links in the description. If you found the video interesting, please leave a like and a comment below with the future cases you want me to talk about. Don't forget to subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. And I'll see you all next time.